Chains by Statute, the Economy of Convict Leasing, and the Rebirth of Forced Labor. By Rue. Understand what followed slavery was not freedom. It was redesign. After 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except as punishment for crime. And that exception became the doorway through which forced labor quietly returned. Across the South, especially in Alabama and Florida, black men were arrested in sweeping waves under black codes and later vagrancy laws, charged with offenses so vague they functioned as traps. Vagrancy, loitering, changing employers without permission, selling cotton after sunset, even insulting gestures, or allegedly startling a white woman. Sentences were staggering. Years, sometimes over a decade, for acts that today would not be crimes at all. Once convicted, these men were not housed primarily for rehabilitation. They were leased. Convict leasing allowed private companies, turpentine camps, coal mines, railroads, and vast timber operations in Florida's pine forests to rent prisoners from the state. In Alabama, by the 1880s and 1890s, convict leasing became so profitable that nearly 3/4 of the state's total revenue came from leasing prisoners to corporations like Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company. The state's budget depended on incarceration. The more prisoners, the more profit. And because the state no longer bore the cost of housing or feeding inmates once leased, companies were incentivized to work them to exhaustion. If a man died, he could be replaced by another arrest. Mortality rates were horrific, far higher than under chattel slavery, because leased convicts were considered disposable. In Florida's timber and turpentine camps, prisoners labored under armed guards, shackled, whipped, and starved. They felled longleaf pines, drained swamps, tapped trees for resin in suffocating heat, and slept in stockades under brutal discipline. Testimonies describe beatings with leather straps, iron shackles cutting into flesh, men chained together while working, and medical neglect so severe that disease spread unchecked. This system thrived not in secrecy, but in normalization. Local sheriffs were paid fees per arrest, creating a pipeline from accusation to profit. Court fines were often impossible to pay, converting poverty into prison time. And because black men were overwhelmingly targeted, the racial order of slavery was preserved through criminal law. When critics exposed the cruelty, journalists, reformers, occasional federal investigations, the system would temporarily rebrand, shifting from leasing to chain gangs, from private contracts to state-run road camps. But forced labor remained central to Southern infrastructure. Roads paved, mines dug, forests cleared, rail lines laid. By the early 20th century, scandals and public outrage forced some states, including Alabama, to formally end convict leasing. Alabama abolished it in 1928, one of the last. But by then, the damage had been done. Generations cycled through a system that criminalized black existence to sustain state economies. Understand the architecture. Criminalization produced prisoners. Prisoners produced revenue. Revenue incentivized more criminalization. The law became the auction block. And when you hear that a man could receive 12 years for something as arbitrary as startling a white woman, understand that the charge was never the point. The labor was. This was not simply punishment. It was economic strategy.
It was slavery reconstructed through statute, legitimized by courts, guarded by rifles, and financed through state budgets. To study convict leasing is to see how freedom can be hollowed out by policy, how language, crime, justice, public safety can mask exploitation, and how the line between prison and plantation once blurred so completely the chains changed form, but not function. Ashe.